Hi, everyone. So just a couple of things, and I'm going to bring our guests up. Why don't our guests come up and I'll introduce you. We have three pretty powerful individuals here, and I just want to tell everyone, we're in our 40th year, Bill. We're getting ready to do 44, that's my New York accent, 40 years.
Original news conference.
Sort of crazy. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you to Simon, where is she, the visionary, as always, trying to make the magic happen. Really appreciate her being here. I see one of my staff is here. I see Monica sitting there. She oversees our work in technology and manufacturing, so thank you for being here as well. So I just want to say a few things just to set the stage, and then we're going to get into a conversation with the gentlemen who are here. I think you're going to find them lively, very, very smart, and we can take the conversation wide and deep. They have a lot of knowledge. But just to set the table, right, just to sort of set the stage, a couple of things. So, obviously we're coming out of COVID, right? We all know that. We've learned a lot. We have had China's inauguration, you go back 21 years with China's inauguration in the World Trade, into the World Trade Organization, and they really dominated a lot of the low-cost goods such as textiles, toys, clothing, robots. We can go all the way down the line. And those industries really opened up a lot for China, right? They allowed them to, expand into manufacturing and production, and they really got ahead of many other countries, including the USA. So as they helped accelerate, they also helped us look at what does it mean to sustain our transition into centralized supply chains. But with the pandemic, which we had a chance to have a great conversation about, with the pandemic and this sort of, some of the words that these guys used included like this experiment, but the pandemic really was an experiment, and it was not an experiment. And we know that there's lots of learning that have come out of all of this. So, here we are. We're a global marketplace. There's this notion of decentralized supply chain, the underpinnings of this fourth industrial revolution, and and tech. And tech is a space that I've had the luxury of spending my career in, and I still have the luxury of helping advance that in a place like Pittsburgh. So, we have data exchange, we have decentralized supply chains, we're going to talk about closed loops in terms of what that means to create barriers to international trade or even strengthening. And we're also, we have the playing field right now that organizations lack funding, technical skills to actually take ourselves into this fourth industrial revolution or 4IR technology. So we're looking at discussions around low-cost labor. What does that mean? Is it important to have low-cost labor? Or maybe we're moving into a world where it's really about high-cost labor and only automation. Who do we leave behind, et cetera? So as you see, we can take this conversation many different ways. So despite all these efforts and amid, the trade war with the United States and China, rising production costs, et cetera, and of course instability in the geopolitical nature of what's happening now, we have, we're looking at ourselves at the US, and the world is looking at themselves in terms of how are they beginning to pivot, and can we pivot, and what does it mean to pivot, and who may leapfrog. So this conversation that we're going to have today is we have, a topic around socioeconomic factors, impacting global supply chains. We're going to talk about some scenarios about the future of global manufacturing. There's a term called glocalization. And, what does that really mean? And then, of course, if we have enough time, and hopefully embedded into this, we're going to talk about, our footprint and what does that mean in terms of net zero goals. So that's a lot. That's a lot to try to cover. We're going to try to pack it in, but you have the pleasure of having these three esteemed gentlemen here who come from really interesting perspectives and have capability to take the conversation a little bit narrower. So I'm thrilled. I'm going to let them quickly introduce themselves and just give like one or two little points about what value they actually do bring into the conversation. I think you'll be very, very impressed. So I'm going to start with Lonnie. I'm going to sit down. I'll pass it over to Omar and then Tariq, and we'll start to have some conversations. So, Lonnie.
Awesome. Great intro. So I'm Lonnie Love. I'm a corporate fellow at Oak Ridge National Lab.
one of the Department of Energy's labs. It was great seeing Mark Johnson up here. He was one of the initial directors of the Advanced Manufacturing Office that funds the facility I work at, the Manufacturing Demonstration Facility at Oak Ridge. This facility really is focused on public-private partnerships with industry, allowing industry to have full access to the Department of Energy's national labs. We get about 6,000, 7,000 visitors a year. We have well over 500 companies that we're partnering with on advanced manufacturing. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking out over, I'm seeing this is Steeltown. I'm looking at the bridge, I'm looking at the water. This is a great place to have this venue in terms of where we're going to take manufacturing and how to revitalize economies in the U.S. and starting here. So I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. Omar.
Yeah. My name is Omar Al-Mahmoud. I lead the ICT Fund. The ICT Fund is based in the UAE. What the ICT Fund does is actually its purpose is to develop the ICT sector in the UAE. We do that through four, you can say, investment pillars. And they are the educational pillar, the R&D pillar, incubation and entrepreneurship, and of course, national ICT initiatives. So we do a wide-ranging, broad set of investments, ranging from scholarships, sending students to study tech-related studies across the globe, in addition to supporting our local universities in laboratories and research. We also support entrepreneurs when it comes to incubation and seed funding. And on the national front, what we call national projects, we do a wide, you can say, ranging projects from space missions to digital transformation projects for the whole UAE. So next month, we do have the Moon Rover, which is launching from Florida, and that is funded by the ICT Fund, in addition to the astronaut program, which hopefully the second one is going up next March into space.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
And Tariq.
Abtariq Al-Hashimi. I'm the Director of Advanced Technology Adoption and Development in the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology in the United Arab Emirates. So my department is responsible for overseeing the implementation of Industry 4.0 within our national manufacturing system. And we're doing this through a set of initiatives and programs which we have launched as part of the UAE's vision for the next 50 years. So we started our program to increase the adoption of 4IR and Industry 4.0 technologies within our manufacturing system. We're working with our partners to raise awareness, to provide incentives, to provide the right infrastructure, and we are promoting collaboration between the public and the private sector so that we can capitalize on this new wave of technologies which are promising a lot of value. And we want to make sure that in the UAE, our manufacturing players are at the frontier of this new fourth industrial revolution.
So you can tell we have people with a lot of good perspective. And we're going to jump in. We were talking about policy and financial policy. So let's talk about that. We talked a little bit about what that meant for the U.S., but also for the globe. So let's explore a little bit about some of the financial mechanisms that might be in place to close this manufacturing, I don't want to say gap, right? But I mean this next wave of this fourth IR. So let's start with the U.S. Let's just talk about the U.S. and then let's start talking about global.
Okay, so I think to predict the future, you need to kind of look at the past.
Sure.
And I had a good friend, Brian Papke, who is the CEO of Mazak, big Japanese machine tool manufacturer. And he told me a story about, I asked him what happened in the 80s in the United States. Again, this is Steeltown. Cincinnati was machine tool center. There was tons of machine tool manufacturers in that space. And in the early 80s, we started seeing a decline. And it still we're still recovering, or trying to recover. And I asked him what happened. And he said, well, in the 80s, the machine tool industry would go to Wall Street to get investment for upgrading, for moving towards next generation technologies. This was the time of numerical controls was starting to come out on CNCs. And they couldn't get it because their returns were only a few percent per year. Long term, it was a long-term investment. And so the U.S. machine tool industry missed out. And so I think learning from those lessons is critical. We're at a new transformation, much like the numerical controls transformed the machine tool industry. The digital is this whole data is going to transform all of manufacturing. But we need to think we need to find ways to think long term. These are investments that will take time to see the return on that investment.
So do you think the financial strategies are in place now for our appetite to get a 2 to 3% return versus, what Wall Street and investors really look for?
I know right now the guy that's doing my investments isn't doing so good, right? The last couple of
You mean personally?
Yeah, personally. And so you have to think, I'm worried. I'm worried about it, that we're so focused on short term that we don't think long term. So I don't know. I can't answer that. But all indicators are the answer is no.
The answer is no. So what about globally? What about either of you guys in terms of what you see? I mean, you do investments and you understand that world. Omar.
Sure. So from our perspective, let's say from the UAE perspective, which sits kind of at the middle between Europe and China, for example, as you mentioned in your introduction. So when it comes to the US, we see there's a gap, as you mentioned, between the manufacturing gap in the US and the manufacturing gap in China. So what we see is the US needs to catch up with China, and to catch up with China when it comes to manufacturing, you need, of course, primarily to reduce the cost of manufacturing, and to reduce the cost of manufacturing, you have to look at why is the cost of manufacturing in China more affordable for the industry. So we looked at what the Chinese have been doing, and they have been extremely smart when it comes to their financial policy. So what they have done is, in 2005 for about 10 years to 2015, the Chinese government has been monitoring the Chinese currency, the yuan, and it has been appreciating in terms of value versus, let's say, the US dollar. And what they realized is if the yuan keeps going up against the US dollar, what would happen is the cost of producing in China would be prohibitively expensive, or it would be similar to the cost of producing in the USA. So overnight, in 2015, what the Chinese government did was that they decided to devalue the yuan overnight by 3%. Right. And what happened was they made the positioning of China a go-to, you can say, marketplace for the industry because of the cheap yuan. What they benefited from was that they benefited on two fronts. One is they made everyone's supply chain affiliated with the Chinese economy. And if you're affiliated with the Chinese economy, it's hard to pull back without hurting yourself if you're going to pull out. Second benefit they gained by devaluing the yuan was they created, you can say, a local industry. How did they do that? So they created a local industry based on making foreign goods extremely expensive because of the cheap yuan versus, for example, a US imported product. So that ushered the whole Chinese economy to manufacture locally for the local Chinese consumer. So they gained on two fronts, and that is a key example of financial policy when it comes to managing, for example, as you mentioned, the manufacturing gap. Right. So the question is then, what shall the US do in that case? So if you do consider, for example, devaluing the US dollar, this won't come across as easy for the Chinese. What they would do is they probably would have, you can say, a repercussion effect by devaluing their yuan more. So then the question presents itself, what shall the US do? Well, the US should basically look at local policy when it comes to the purchasing power of the public sector. Instead of depending on a supply chain which has no policy saying that whatever you need to purchase has to be manufactured in the US. If that is introduced, then the purchasing power, instead of being diluted across international products or international components, would then primarily usher the local industry to focus on setting up a manufacturing unit here in the US, or stipulating that the public sector departments should purchase primarily 100% US produced products.
A very government-focused solution, right? Do you want to add anything to that?
Let me add another perspective, since we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution and financial policy. So for us to drive this revolution, I would say, we really need a toolkit of financial instruments, and we should really be financing and making sure that we're allocating capital for the full value chain or for the full spectrum, beginning from the science and the fundamental research, all the way to technology development, and eventually to industrialization. 4IR and the technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution have a lot of potential, but these are really risky investments.
Right.
And you have to know that the private sector will not just invest by itself to capitalize on these investments. We have to de-risk it. We have to de-risk it, and we have to showcase that the return on investment is worth it. And this is where we'll get traction, and we'll see that the private sector are pitching in and driving the development of these technologies. So I would say that funding the science is important, and making sure that we're funding the pipeline of fundamental research, applied research, all the way to bridging this commercialization gap is very, very important to unlock the value from the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, and I think building on that, I think that the cost to go from, I think first off, I couldn't agree more. Universities, labs, there's ample opportunities for government, for industry to come together and de-risk. Because you're right, going into a whole new area, especially if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, could put you out of business. So I think looking for ways where local government, federal government, universities can seamlessly work with companies, especially the SMEs, the small, medium-sized enterprises, helping them have access, I think is a game changer in terms of helping companies transition into these new economies and into these new processes.
I couldn't agree anymore, especially with SMEs,
Yeah.
since they're usually the most vulnerable to lack of financing and funding. So definitely, I think any policy direction or policy instruments should be directed at the SMEs and how we can get them on board.
And I think when you think strategically, like this is, like I said, I look around here, you have multiple highways coming together. It's hard for a small company to hop on a plane and fly across the country, but they can hop in a car and drive 4 hours, 6 hours. So I think having these crossroads where there's also a huge, this is in the center of the industrial belt, just providing access and also messaging that you're here to help them, I think is really critical.
In the U.S., though, I can speak to, there are tools that some think are de-risking tools. So SBIRs, STTRs, right? Some of those. But it seems like we don't tap into that.
But I think that's funding. That's funding. I think there's also how do you provide access to people, to equipment, and that's again where I think these universities, the manufacturing institutes, the labs, those are huge government investments, right? The federal government has pumped a lot of money into these labs, into these universities. All I'm saying is open up the doors. Open up the doors and let people have unfettered access and to not only the facilities, but to the people.
Right.
That's a big one.
So the financial tools, do you think the financial tools are there to create those kinds of open door?
Yeah, I do. I think most of and again, I mentioned earlier how the Department of Energy made a huge commitment probably around 10 years ago to starting an advanced manufacturing office. And part of that was kind of trying to open up the labs to the DOE labs to industry and giving them access. No money changed hands. It's not a funding source. They can get the funding source from SBIRs, STTRs. It's more of just providing access to the state-of-the-art equipment. But again, I think the equipment is just part of the puzzle. I think you need to have subject matter experts that are open and freely to help these small and medium-sized enterprises carve into a new area. I think that's what could be a game changer.
And
I think, focusing on policy and financial instruments, which can specifically do that. Instruments that can promote collaboration. And they do exist. We just need to emphasize them and direct them a little bit and ensure that they do have the access to the right infrastructure, the tangible and the intangible infrastructure. And this is going to be a game changer.
And do you think we can do that globally? Do you think that from the view globally, or is that something that's insular?
Well, I mean, I think there's other countries that are actually ahead of us on this.
Right.
You know, Germany has had their Fraunhofers for decades. The AMRC in Sheffield. China is starting to establish these manufacturing networks. So I think you can do it globally. What would be interesting is if you can start to network these. You know, so you have kind of this friend of mine talks about this hub and spoke. You know, you have these networks of networks where you share information. I think the main thing on this Industry 4.0, where manufacturing is going, another colleague of mine, Tom Kerfus, he talks about how it's just about innovation fast. You want to innovate and change what you're doing faster than your competition. Whoever's fastest to product is going to win. But you have to be ready to pivot pretty quickly when others catch up to something new. And I think that's what is changing, is that ability to adapt extremely fast.
Okay. You want to add anything to that before I jump? Omar?
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned like having a global, you can say, spread to do what you mentioned, you have to consider in that case, you can say the socioeconomic factors, such as, of course, how would you get funding across different countries, and each one having their own individual interest. If you can't, for example, have individual companies working together for a greater good, or how would you have countries then sharing, you can say, resources and laboratories and so forth. So unless there is, as in our previous panel I've heard, there's a mutual exploitation as a concept, there's mutual benefit from both, then you would have those.
Well, and I think I'm not advocating that they fund each other. It's just sharing of best practices. I think that there's a lot to be gained, because that's kind of where we started. We didn't just come up with a business model for how to have a public-private partnership. We looked at others that have done it and said, what are things that we can learn from? What are things that are working and aren't working, and let's adapt it. And we're still doing that. And I think the next organization, the next country that does it, will look at us and do it better. But I think it's that just sharing of knowledge is really powerful.
Indeed. I mean, I'll give you a case study, which is what the partnership, what came out of the partnership between the UAE and South Korea was teaching the UAE how to design and build satellites. So as a young nation, we didn't have the capabilities or the engineering skills to do that. And what happened was the agreement was that they would exchange knowledge in exchange for teaching the UAE side how to put together a satellite. And once that happened, of course, they got their financial rewards, and of course, we got our, you can say, a strategic educational output of that. And thus, what that transpired was the Mars probe, which today is in orbit around Mars. So an exchange of knowledge, and of course the Mars probe output is of course for humanity at large. All the data that is streamed back is actually public data that could be shared with all universities across the globe. So once you start sharing knowledge, the fruits of knowledge have actually showcased themselves today around Mars and on planet Earth. So it is an intriguing, you can say, case study to be studied, where you share knowledge and what can transpire from that.
So I do have a good example from the UAE on whatever we're discussing right now. 1 year ago, we launched what we call the Industry 4.0 Champions Network, which is basically a consortium of MNCs, national champions, the government, and a few academic players within the UAE. And the objective of launching this was to create a community within the UAE, to exchange knowledge on 4IR, to co-develop standards, which are really crucial for 4IR, for the widespread deployment of 4IR. And at the same time, to support the SME community by sharing use cases and sometimes collaborating on projects. And the nice thing is, so it has been a year since we launched this network, and we're already collaborating on the international front. So we do have active collaboration with some research centers and technology centers in Turkey. And we are expanding the network as we go. So answering that question, yes, we could do it on a global level. And there are other initiatives and programs which has attempted to do that.
Good example. So now let's talk about supply chain for a little bit, right? That's part of our conversation, and this whole thing about decentralization. So, we talked earlier when we were in our own green room talking about this closed loop supply chain, and does it stifle innovation, and what did we learn from COVID, and how can technology enable this cross-sector collaboration? First, let's talk about what you each saw during that period of time, and then where do you think we can go? So whoever wants to grab it first.
Well, I think COVID was we're still learning from COVID. I hope we never go through that lesson again. We saw in the U.S. a radical dependence upon foreign countries for our healthcare, and I think it was pretty scary. So that was the negative. But on the positive, we saw an ability for industry to pivot and address issues pretty quickly. We had, I was telling you the story. We got a call. I got a call from Health and Human Services about test kits back in March of 20, when it was raging all over the world. And we couldn't get enough test tubes. The White House wanted 10 million to 20 million test kits manufactured per week, and we could only get about 500,000 test tubes. And so HHS calls me. Mark knows me. HHS calls this Rachel Kellogg and says, she's telling me what's going on. She goes, "Do you think Oak Ridge could help?" I was like, sure, we can help. Next thing I know, Sunday morning, my phone has exploded, and the White House had called her, and she said, "Oak Ridge is going to solve the problem for us." so my lab director's calling, everybody's calling, my boss is calling. I was like, it'll be fine, we'll figure it out. And I didn't know what we were going to do. But this gets into the adaptability of the supply chain. We had a meeting that Monday morning. We had a hypothesis that you could use Coke bottle preforms as a substitute for test tubes. Within 2 days, I was on the phone with the chief operating officer at Coca-Cola, and I told him, I said, we need about 10 million of these little test tubes that you guys make. And he goes, "Well, I'll send them to you." And he goes, "The funny thing, Lonnie," he goes, "Coca-Cola bottling makes 2 billion Coke bottles a week. And when COVID hit, we took a 3% cut in our sales. We got a surplus of these things." A week later, they're shipping 2 million test tubes these Coke bottle preforms to Longhorn Therapeutics down in Texas. So it's that adaptability. I think, and being willing to look for the least viable solution. I just need something to work. And being able to pivot quickly is one of the things, and I think this whole Industry 4.0, that's where I think we're going to go. Now, that was one example, but I think we have new problems coming down the pipe. The one that I'm getting hammered on is castings and forgings. You know, the U.S. doesn't have, again, I'm looking at all this steel, and we don't have foundries anymore. And most of the wind turbines, the hydro generators, we're talking about going green, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard because these are big pieces of equipment. Most of those pieces of equipment come from China. The big castings and forgings, and the cost now for shipping exceeds the cost of making the part. So I think it's going to be interesting. We need creative solutions.
Well, let's jump to talking about, I don't know how we're doing on time. Someone's going to need to tell me that. Are we witnessing the end of, centralized supply chains? Like, think about what we learned through COVID and the dependency and all that we got cut off from everywhere around the world, right? We talked a little bit about that. You want to jump in and want to talk about that?
Sure. So, I don't really think there is a pure centralized supply chain. I mean, they are decentralized to an extent, and you can consider them centralized to an extent. But again, the problem with, of course, when you're decentralized, you're dependent on a variety of different factors. And let's say you're not just on a regional basis, let's say you're not just in the US, but you do have, and I think most supply chains are dependent on, you can say, foreign products, manufactured products, primarily in China. So you also, as an industry, have to look at a number of factors and socioeconomic factors such as income. You also have to look at education, and you have to look at occupation. And you'll also have to look at, you also have to consider into your planning that you are more prone and hypersensitive to geopolitical changes that may arise if anything happens. Take for the case, as you mentioned, COVID today, how it disrupted supply chains. And then today you have Russia and Ukraine, how that is disrupting supply chains across the globe. So if you as an industry are not taking into consideration these geopolitical factors into your supply chain planning, then whenever COVID, for example, hits, or whenever some geopolitical, you can say, the geopolitical action has taken place, then what would the repercussions be on your supply chain? And then on a longer, you can say, horizon is, you have to look at a different set of values, a set of factors. So when I mentioned earlier is that you have to look at income, and when I meant income is that you have different countries coming up where they're growing stronger when it comes to income. The purchasing power of their individual, you can say, consumer is growing. So what does that mean for you as an industry? That means that their people would actually shift in terms of the value. So I'll give you an example or a story. So the Saudi government was considering transacting or selling oil in the Chinese yuan. And what sort of repercussions would have that on the US dollar when it comes to, what would the value of the US dollar stand in the international standing when it comes to international trade? So that's what I meant. You have to look at your income. Is your income worth what it is as it is today? Or would some other, you can say, international factor devalue, for example, your income? And then I also would recommend that people look at education, primarily because you have a skilled workforce that is coming up across the globe because of the accessibility of education and materials, which wasn't the case. Primarily developed nations had it, they had a good, strong educational system, and the benefit of that was a strong economy. Given that the education and materials is being, you can say, digitized and accessible 24/7, what do you think the long-term goal or the long-term effect would be on developing nations? Let's say some country in Africa comes up and adopts, for example, the latest, you can say, technologies in terms of education, and then they don't have the Harvards and they don't have the Stanfords. What would then Stanford and Harvard look like? The only value of having a legacy, you can say, education institute is in the selection process, but not in the actual educational material. So as an industry, you need to look at your skilled workforce and what's the long-term, you can say, horizon for different, you can say, geopolitical reasons and, of course, for your planning reasons. Because if everyone's focused primarily on what they have at hand and not on the long-term picture of these factors, when they hit, they would hit hard for the industry, especially if you're an SME or a local SME. You have to look at the bigger picture.
So what does it mean for people now, right? We didn't talk about people.
The current workforce?
Well, we've got
Post-COVID, I'm trying to figure that out, as I'm sure most people are. I think that, one of the discussions we were having is, how does COVID showed us that we could work remotely, which helps in some respects, but worry a little bit in terms of that face-to-face interaction that's so important. And how do we're talking about innovation. Usually innovation happens through random impacts. And so how do you keep the workforce vibrant and engaged, but also we're going to have to be flexible. I know most of my colleagues that I talk to, we're seeing significantly higher attrition than we've seen in years. And because I think the workforce is changing. I heard one of the previous discussions, again, I think it was Mark was saying that he's excited about the next generation or the generation after. I'm excited and I'm terrified at the same time because I don't know where they're going to go, and so it's going to be pretty interesting to see the evolution of the workforce in the next few years.
So I think when it comes to the workforce, there are many interesting points, but one thing that we have to keep in mind is we have to keep the workforce relevant for the industries of the future. With these digital technologies, I think the skill set that will be needed in the future is really, really different. So for IR, it brings a window of opportunities for advanced economies and for latecomers. However, if we really want to exploit it, I think the workforce needs to be ready, and for that we need the right educational program. I don't think in college we really need to start at the schools, and we need to embed these concepts. And one thing that's really needed is to keep this workforce relevant is that they need to be adaptable. So the skill sets are changing, and I was reading a study the other day, and basically they need to learn new skills every 5 to 10 years. Whereas in the past, with 1 degree, you could probably remain in your job and retire and you're well off. But that's no longer the case.
Right. Okay. We have how many minutes? We're finished?
You're negative.
Do you have any wrap-up points that you want to make? I mean, I have a list of more questions, but I want to be sensitive. Yeah. This whole concept was about creating value from decentralization, and I think we went all over, right? Yes. We went and said it's not just one thing. We can't be interdependent. We have to be interdependent. We have to be independent. So all these things. So are there some, final words that you want to share?
Well, I'm short-term pessimistic, but long-term optimistic. I think that venues like this where people can come together, it's wonderful to see people's faces again. It's wonderful to interact with colleagues and friends from around the world. The last few years have been pretty rough, but I think I'm long-term optimistic that things are going to change, and manufacturing is one of the key to prosperity. And again, I think that it has to be a global movement. It can't be just in one country. We have to think globally. So I'm pretty optimistic and excited about where Industry 4.0, whatever you want to call it, is coming.
That's what we're calling it.
We'll go with that.
Yeah. I mean,
Any final words on what?
Yeah, absolutely. So with of course, with the fourth industrial revolution it's at the core of it is, of course, innovation. And my kind of key takeaway would be is you should manage your innovation just like you manage your supply chain. And you should track it and monitor it and improve it always as if it was a separate supply chain. And if you do that and you look at it that way, then of course you're going to innovate continuously and arrive at solutions to all your problems in the industry.
Final words?
So I think if the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it would be that our global value chain or our global supply chain is not as resilient as we thought it was. In fact, it's fragile. So, and what we witnessed is that with digital technologies, we're able to do a lot. People were able to go and work from home. Many of the businesses shifted online. And I think what we witnessed was just the beginning. I know 4IR might be an abstract concept, but for us to unlock the value of 4IR, we really need to be able to imagine it. And when I say we need to be able to imagine it, we need new ways of doing business. We need new business models, a new global value chains, a new supply chain. And I think this will be underpinned by these new technologies. And I think those countries or people who are willing to take the risk, who are willing to invest from now, will be able to reap the benefits. So, and thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure getting to know each of you. Thank you all. A round of applause for them. Thank you all. And I'm passing the baton back to Bill.